Everyone thinks Mahatma Gandhi coined the phrase, "an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind," as the ultimate bumper sticker summary of pacifism. He never said it. Not in his speeches, not in his voluminous letters, and not in his collected written works. The iconic quote is a mid-century American biographer's invention, popularized by a Hollywood movie, and it hides a far darker, far more unsettling truth about what Gandhi actually believed about human conflict, physical violence, and moral cowardice. An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. In September 1920, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was 51 years old and standing on the razor's edge of total political transformation. He was not yet the untouchable, saintly icon in simple white homespun cotton robes that you see preserved on framed poster prints or modern currency. He was a ruthless, London-trained barrister turned shrewd political strategist, operating inside a country that was violently boiling over after decades of imperial subjection and war. He was a man who had spent 20 years in South Africa honing a radical strategy of mass resistance, returning to India to find a national movement desperate for leadership, but deeply divided over how to tear down the British Empire. The air inside the special session of the Indian National Congress in Calcutta was suffocatingly hot, thick with humidity and the smell of thousands of bodies packed into a temporary wooden pavilion. The dim light of paraffin lamps flickered against sweat-drenched faces as delegates shouted over one another in a chaotic, deafening roar. Outside, the streets of Bengal were alive with unrest. The year before, in April 1919, the British Empire had dropped its facade of civilized rule in the northern city of Amritsar. Inside a walled public garden called the Jallianwala Bagh, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer had ordered 74 British Indian Army soldiers to block the only narrow exit and fire indiscriminately into a peaceful, unarmed crowd gathered for a festival. They fired 1,650 rounds in 10 minutes, stopping only when their ammunition was spent. Hundreds lay dead on the blood-soaked ground. Over 1,000 were left screaming for water in the scorching heat. When news of the massacre spread, the illusion of British justice evaporated instantly. Younger, radical Indian nationalists were done talking. Militant factions across the subcontinent argued that British bullets could only be answered with Indian dynamite, that violence was the only language an occupying power understood, and that the time for polite petitions was over. Gandhi stepped onto the platform. His body was lean, almost delicate, but his presence carried an unnerving, absolute certainty. He did not ask the crowd to turn the other cheek out of fear, weakness, or submission. He asked them to disarm because he believed physical weapons were an admission of moral defeat. He looked out over the sea of furious delegates and delivered a message that stunned the militants to their core. Nonviolence was not a strategy for the weak who had no weapons. It was a devastating psychological weapon forged specifically for those who had the capacity to kill, but chose instead to absorb the enemy's strike until the oppressor's arm grew heavy with the weight of their own conscience. He withheld his full philosophical justification for several long minutes, letting the audience feel the sheer absurdity of his proposition. In a nation of 300 million people facing machine guns and armored cars, he was asking them to step forward naked into the blows without raising a single fist in self-defense. The popular misquote, "an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind," frames nonviolence as a gentle, mutual compromise. A sensible, pacifist agreement that everyone should just stop hurting each other so that nobody loses their sight. It makes nonviolence sound like common sense, a soft moral lesson suitable for a children's classroom or a corporate mediation seminar. Gandhi's actual philosophy, Satyagraha, which translates to truth force or soul force, was anything but gentle. It was demanding, aggressive, and brutally uncompromising. Gandhi did not view nonviolence as a way to avoid pain or preserve comfort. On the contrary, he believed that deliberate, conscious suffering was the single most powerful engine of political and spiritual change in human history. More shockingly to modern ears, Gandhi explicitly hated cowardice far more than he hated violence. In his famous 1920 essay Between the Sword and the Shield, Gandhi wrote lines that break the modern, saintly stereotype completely. "I do believe that where there is only a choice between cowardice and violence, I would advise violence." He elaborated that he would far rather see India use arms to defend her honor than see her become a cowardly, helpless witness to her own dishonor. To Gandhi, an armed fighter who stood up against an oppressor was far higher on the moral spectrum than a passive bystander who claimed to be nonviolent simply because they were too terrified to pick up a gun. The popular quote makes nonviolence look like the easy, obvious choice for gentle people who hate conflict. Gandhi saw nonviolence as an elite, agonizing discipline meant only for the incredibly brave. A coward who runs away from a fight or accepts oppression out of fear is not practicing Satyagraha. They are practicing cowardice. True nonviolence requires holding the capability, the anger, and the physical power to strike back, and then deliberately choosing to stand your ground and take the blow without flinching. It was not a call for peace. It was a call for a new kind of war. This terrifyingly high moral standard did not go unchallenged. It horrified and infuriated many of Gandhi's most brilliant contemporaries, creating a rift through the heart of the Indian independence movement that lasted for decades. The most famous pushback came from Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, a charismatic, dynamic leader who believed Gandhi's nonviolence was an idealistic fantasy that played directly into British hands. Bose argued that no empire in human history had ever surrendered power simply because it felt guilty about the suffering of its subjects. Imperial powers understood steel, logistics, and military force. Bose eventually broke with Gandhi, fled India under disguise, traveled through Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and formed the Indian National Army, INA, to fight British forces directly on the battlefields of Burma during World War II. Bose asked a devastating question. Why should an imperial ruler possess a conscience? If your opponent feels no shame, absorbing their violence simply makes it easier for them to exterminate you. A different, equally sharp critique came from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the brilliant jurist, leader of the Dalit, untouchable movement, and the chief architect of India's constitution. Ambedkar saw Gandhi's philosophy of spiritualized nonviolence and self-sacrifice as a dangerous distraction that ignored the brutal structural violence of the Hindu caste system. Ambedkar pointed out that for millions of lower caste Indians, violence was not an abstract political choice. It was a daily reality enforced by social hierarchies. He argued that telling marginalized people to quietly endure suffering in the hope of transforming their oppressor's heart was asking them to accept perpetual servitude. Meanwhile, young revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh argued that public acts of targeted political violence were necessary to shake the Indian public out of centuries of political apathy. When Bhagat Singh was sentenced to hang by the British at age 23, millions of Indians begged Gandhi to use his immense leverage to demand a reprieve. Gandhi refused to make Singh's reprieval a non-negotiable condition for his negotiations with the British viceroy, holding firm to his stance that political violence could never be sanctioned. This decision caused thousands of young Indians to march through the streets shouting slogans against Gandhi himself, viewing his refusal as a betrayal of a fallen patriot. So where did the famous line, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind," actually come from? The phrase was created by the American journalist and biographer Louis Fisher in his 1950 book, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi. Fisher used the line as a poetic, summarizing metaphor to explain Gandhi's critique of retributive justice to Western readers. Decades later, screenwriter John Briley and director Sir Richard Attenborough placed the line directly into the mouth of actor Ben Kingsley in the 1982 Oscar-winning biographical film Gandhi. The movie was a global cultural phenomenon, seen by tens of millions of people worldwide. It cemented Kingsley's performance as the definitive image of Gandhi for generations, and in doing so, it stamped a screenwriter's catchy line onto historical memory as an authentic, ancient proverb spoken by the Mahatma himself. Today, the quote is routinely deployed across pop culture, digital media, and corporate speechwriting as a lazy defense of conflict avoidance and middle ground neutrality. During breaking political protests or social unrest, media pundits routinely tweet the quote to demand immediate quiet and calm, using a hollowed-out version of Gandhi's name to silence uncomfortable rage and preserve the social status quo, ignoring the fact that Gandhi's actual methods were designed to disrupt cities, fill prisons, and shut down economies. In corporate HR seminars and management workshops, executives cite the line to advocate for compromise and conflict resolution, completely stripping away Gandhi's core premise that true resolution requires leaning directly into tension and accepting extreme personal sacrifice rather than seeking a comfortable middle ground. On personal development social feeds, self-help creators post the quote alongside sunset images to justify cutting toxic people out of their lives smoothly, turning a philosophy of active, agonizing, direct engagement with one's enemy into a simple trick for personal psychological comfort. The quote has been sanitized into a slogan for peace and quiet. But Gandhi never cared about quiet. He cared about truth and justice, and he knew that achieving either required intense, uncomfortable friction. The ultimate tragedy of Gandhi's life is that the very violent forces he attempted to master through nonviolent discipline ended up shattering his country and taking his life. In August 1947, British rule in India finally collapsed, but the victory was accompanied by a catastrophic partition that split the subcontinent into two nations, India and Pakistan. The borders, drawn haphazardly in a matter of weeks by a British judge who had never set foot in India, cut directly through communities, farms, and families. The resulting mass migration was one of the largest and most violent in human history. Sectarian riots erupted across the Punjab and Bengal. Neighbors turned on neighbors with swords, torches, and rifles. Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered in the streets, and millions became refugees overnight. Gandhi, now an old, frail man in his late 70s, refused to participate in the independence celebrations in New Delhi. Instead, he walked barefoot through the mud of riot-torn villages in Bengal and fasted to the brink of death in Calcutta and Delhi, using his own failing body as a human shield to force mobs to lay down their weapons. His moral authority managed to bring temporary quiet to whole cities where thousands of armed troops had failed, earning him the title of a one-man boundary force from the British viceroy. Yet the rising tide of religious nationalism could not be contained by one man's fasts. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi walked across the lawn of Birla House in New Delhi to lead a multi-faith prayer meeting. Out of the crowd stepped Natharam Godse, a fanatical Hindu nationalist who believed that Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence and his insistence on protecting the Muslim minority had weakened India and betrayed the Hindu nation. Godse bowed out of formal respect, pulled out a concealed semi-automatic pistol, and fired 3 bullets directly into Gandhi's chest at point-blank range. The man who spent his entire life arguing that true strength lay in absorbing violence without retaliating was struck down by an assassin who viewed non-violence as the ultimate form of national weakness. We cling to the fake quote because it reassures us that choosing peace is simple, safe, and comfortable. But if your nonviolence is just a convenient excuse to avoid confrontation when the stakes are high, are you actually practicing peace? Or are you just hiding your fear behind a philosopher you never really understood?